I have always lived a bland life. Not an unintelligent one, but bland. I have contributed nothing to the world, and in that I have much in common with almost every soul on this earth. But on the other hand, I have not taken away anything either. I have, in short, asked merely to be left alone. Life is difficult enough without undue association with people. What can one do with the remaining 4 months of a bland life? I have no idea how long I walked and thought on that subject, but eventually I found myself on the long, curving bridge that sweeps down to join the lake drive. The sounds of mechanical music intruded themselves upon my mind, and I looked down. A circus or a very large carnival lay below. It was the world of shabby magic, where the gold is gilt, where the top-hatted ringmaster is as much a gentleman as the medals on his chest are authentic, and where the pink ladies on horseback are hard-faced and narrow-eyed. It was the domain of the harsh-voiced vendors and the short change. I have always felt that the demise of the big circus may be counted as one of the cultural advances of the 20th century, yet I found myself descending on the footbridge. In a few moments, I was on the midway between the rows and stands where human mutations are exploited and exhibited for the entertainment of all children. Eventually, I reached the big top and idly watched the bored ticket-taker in his elevated box at one side of the main entrance. A pleasant-faced man leading 2 little girls approached him and presented him several cardboard rectangles, which appeared to be passes. The ticket-taker ran his finger down a printed list at the side. His eyes hardened, and he scowled down at the man and the children for a moment. Then slowly and deliberately he tore up the passes to bits and let the fragments drift to the ground. "These are no damn good," he said. The man below him flushed. I don't understand." "You didn't leave the posters up," the ticket master snapped. "Beat it, Crumb." The children looked up at their father, their faces puzzled. Would he do something about this? He stood there, and the white of anger appeared on his face. He seemed about to say something, but then looked down at the children. He closed his eyes for a moment, as though to control his anger. And then he said, "Come on, kids. Let's go home." He led them away, down the midway, and the children looked back, bewildered, but saying nothing. I approached the ticket-taker. "Why did you do that?" He glanced down. "What's it to ya?" "Perhaps a great deal." He studied me irritably. "Because he didn't leave up the posters." "I heard that before. Now explain it." He exhaled, as though it cost him money. "Our advance man goes through a town 2 weeks before we get there. He leaves posters advertising the show any place he can. Grocery stores, shoe shops, meat markets, any place that'll post them in the window and keep them there until the show comes to town. He hands out 2 or 3 passes for that. But what some of these jokers don't know is that we check up. If the posters aren't still up when we hit town, the passes are no good." "I see," I said dryly. "And so you tear up the passes in their faces and in front of their children." Evidently that man removed the posters from the window of his shop too soon. Or perhaps those passes were given to him by a man who removed the posters from his window. What's the difference? The passes are no good. Perhaps there is no difference in that respect. But do you realize what you've done? His eyes were narrow, trying to estimate me in any power I might have. "You have committed one of the most cruel of human acts," I said stiffly. "You have humiliated a man before his children. You have inflicted a scar that will remain with him and them as long as they live. You will take those children home, and it will be a long, long way. And what can he say to them? Are you a cop? I am not a cop. Children of that age regard their father as the finest man in the world, the kindest, the bravest. And now they will remember that a man had been bad to their father, and he had been unable to do anything about it." "So I tore up his passes. Why didn't he buy tickets? Are you a city inspector?" "I am not a city inspector. Did you expect him to buy tickets after that humiliation? You left the man with no recourse whatsoever. He could not buy tickets, and he could not create a well-justified scene. because the children were there with him. He could do nothing, nothing at all but retreat with 2 children who wanted to see your miserable circus, and now they cannot. I looked down at the foot of the stand. There were the fragments of many more dreams, the debris of other men who had committed the capital crime of not leaving their posters up long enough. You could have at least said, "I'm sorry, sir, but your passes aren't valid," and then you could have explained politely and quietly why. "I'm not paid to be polite." He showed his yellow teeth. "And mister, I like tearing up the passes. It gives me a kick." And there it was. He was a little man who had been given a little power, and he used it like a Caesar. He half rose. "Now get the hell out of here, mister, before I come down and chase you all over the lot." Yes, he was a man of cruelty, a 2-dimensional animal born without feeling and sensitivity and fated to do harm as long as he existed. He was a creature who should be eliminated from the face of the earth. If only I had the power to. I stared up at the twisted face for a moment more, and then turned on my heel and left. At the top of the bridge, I got on a bus and rode to the sports shop at 37th. I purchased a .32 caliber revolver and a box of cartridges. Why do we not murder? Is it because we do not feel the moral justification for such a final act? Or is it more because we fear the consequences if we are caught, the cost to us, to our families, to our children? And so we suffer wrongs with meekness, and we endure them because to eliminate them might cause us more pain than we already have. But I had no family, no close friends, and 4 months to live. The sun had set and the carnival lights were bright when I got off the bus at the bridge. I looked down at the midway, and he was still in his box. How should I do it? I wondered. Just march up to him and shoot him as he sat on his little throne? The problem was solved for me. I saw him replaced by another man, apparently his relief. He lit a cigarette and strolled off the midway towards a dark lakefront. I caught up with him around the bend, concealed by the bushes. It was a lonely place, but close enough to the carnival that the sounds could still reach me. He heard my footsteps and turned. A tight smile came to his lips, and he rubbed the knuckles of one hand. "You're asking for it, mister." His eyes widened when he saw my revolver. "How old are you?" I asked. "Look, mister," he said swiftly, "I only got a couple tens in my pocket." "How old are you?" I repeated. His eyes flicked nervously. 32. I shook my head sadly. "You could have lived into your 70s, perhaps 40 more years of your life, if you had only taken the simple trouble to act like a human being." His face whitened. "Are you off your rocker or something?" "A possibility." I pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot was not as loud as I had expected, or perhaps it was lost against the background of the carnival noises. He staggered and dropped to the edge of the path, where he was quite dead. I sat down on a nearby park bench and waited. 5 minutes. 10. Had no one heard the shot? I became suddenly conscious of hunger. I hadn't eaten since noon. The thought of being taken to a police station and being questioned for any length of time seemed unbearable. I had a headache, too. I tore a page from my pocket notebook and began writing. A careless word may be forgiven, but a lifetime of cruel rudeness cannot. This man deserved to die. I was about to sign my name, but then decided that initials would be sufficient for the time being. I did not want to be apprehended before I had a good meal and some aspirins. I folded the page and put it into the dead ticket-taker's breast pocket. I met no one. As I returned up the path and ascended to the footbridge, I walked to Weschler's, probably the finest restaurant in the city. The prices are, under normal circumstances, beyond me, but I thought that this time I could indulge myself. After dinner, I decided an evening bus ride might be in order. I rather enjoyed that form of city excursion after all. My freedom of movement would soon become restricted. The driver of the bus was an impatient man, and clearly his passengers were his enemies. However, it was a beautiful night. The bus was not crowded. At 68th Street, a fragile white-haired woman with cameo features waited at the curb. The driver begrudgingly brought his vehicle to a stop and opened the door. She smiled and nodded to the passengers as she put her foot on the first step. and one could see that her life was one of gentle happiness and very few bus rides. "Well," the bus driver snapped, "is it going to take you all day to get in?" She flushed and stammered, "I'm sorry." She presented him with a $5 bill. He glared. "Don't you have any change?" The flush deepened. "I don't think so, but I'll look." The driver was evidently ahead on his schedule, and he waited. And another thing was clear. He was enjoying this. She found a quarter and held it up timorously. "In the box," he snapped. She dropped it into the box. The driver moved his vehicle forward jerkily, and she almost fell. Just in time, she managed to catch hold of his strap. Her eyes went to the passengers as though to apologize for herself, for not having moved faster, for not having immediate change, for almost falling. The smile trembled, and she sat down. At 80 seconds, she pulled the buzzer cord, rose, and made her way forward. The driver scowled over his shoulder as he came to a stop. "Use the rear door. Don't you people ever learn to use the rear door?" I'm all in favor of using the rear door, especially when a bus is crowded. But there were only half a dozen passengers on this bus, and they all read their newspapers with frightened neutrality. She turned, her face pale, and left by the rear door. The evening she was going to have, had now been ruined. Perhaps many more evenings with the thought of it. I rode the bus to the end of the line. I was the only passenger when the driver turned around and was parked. It was a deserted, dimly lit corner, and there was no waiting passengers at the small shelter on the curb. The driver glanced at his watch, lit a cigarette, and then noticed me. "If you're taking the ride back, mister, put another quarter in the box. No free riders here." I rose from my seat and walked slowly to the front of the bus. "How old are you?" He narrowed his eyes. "That's none of your business." "About 35, I'd imagine," I said. "You'd have had another 30 or more years ahead of you." I produced the revolver. He dropped the cigarette. "Take the money," he said. "I'm not interested in money. I'm thinking about a gentle lady, and perhaps the hundreds of other gentle ladies and kind, harmless men and smiling children. You're a criminal. There's no justification for what you do to them. There is no justification for your existence." And I killed him. I sat down and waited. After 10 minutes, I was still alone with the corpse. I realized that I was sleepy, incredibly sleepy. It might be better if I turned myself in to the police after a good night's sleep. I wrote my justification for the driver's demise on a sheet of notepaper, added my initials, and put the page in his pocket. I walked 4 blocks before I found a taxi and took it to my apartment building. I slept soundly, and perhaps I dreamed. But if I did, my dreams were pleasant and innocuous, and it was almost 9 before I woke. After a shower and a leisurely breakfast, I selected my best suit. I remembered I had not yet paid that month's telephone bill. I made out a check and addressed an envelope. I discovered that I was out of stamps, but no matter. I would get one on the way to the police station. I was almost there when I remembered the stamp. I stopped at a corner drugstore. It was the place I had never entered before. The proprietor, in a semi-medical jacket, sat behind the soda fountain, reading a newspaper, and a salesman was making notations in a large order book. The proprietor did not look up when I entered, and he spoke to the salesman. "They've got his fingerprints on the notes. They've got his handwriting. They've got his initials. What's wrong with the police?" The salesman shrugged. "What good are fingerprints if the murderer doesn't have his in the police files? Same goes for the handwriting, if you've got nothing to compare it with. And how many people in the city have the initials LT?" He closed his book. "I'll be back next week." When he was gone, the druggist continued reading the newspaper. I cleared my throat. He finished reading a long paragraph and looked up. "Well?" "I'd like a 4-stamp stamp, please." It appeared almost as though I had struck him. He stared at me for 15 seconds, and then left his stool and slowly made his way to the rear of the store towards a small, barred window. I was about to follow him, but a display of pipes at my elbow caught my attention. After a while, I felt eyes upon me and looked up. The druggist stood at the far end of the store, one hand on his hip and the other disdainfully holding the single stamp. Do you expect me to bring it to you? Now I remembered a small boy of 6 who had had 5 pennies. Not just one this time, but 5. Oh, and this was in the days of penny candies. He had been entranced by the display in the showcase, the 50 varieties of sweet things, and his mind had revolved into a pleasant indecision. The red whips? The licorice? The grab bags? Not the cherry candies. He didn't like those. And then he had become conscious of the druggist standing beside the display case, tapping one foot. The druggist's eyes had smoldered with irritation. No, more than that, with anger. Are you going to take all day for your lousy nickel? He had been a sensitive boy, and it had felt as though he had received a blow. His precious 5 pennies were nothing. This man despised them, and this man despised him. He pointed numbly and blindly. 5 cents of that. When he left the store, he found that he had the cherry candies, but that didn't really matter. Whatever it had been, he wouldn't have eaten it. Now I stared at the druggist and the 4-cent stamp, and the narrow hatred for anyone who did not contribute directly to his profits. I had no doubt he would fawn if I purchased one of his pipes. But I thought of the 4-cent stamp and the bag of cherry candy I had thrown out so many years ago. I moved towards the rear end of the store and took the revolver out of my pocket. How old are you? When he was dead, I did not wait longer than necessary to write a note. I had killed for myself this time, and I felt the need of a drink. I went several doors down the street and entered a small bar. I ordered a brandy and a water. After 10 minutes, I heard the siren of a squad car. The bartender went to the window. It's just down the street. He took off his jacket. Go see what this is all about. If anybody comes in, tell them I'll be right back. Oh, gotta see what this is all about. If anybody comes in, tell them I'll be right back. He put the bottle of brandy on the bar. Help yourself, but tell me how many. I sipped the brandy slowly and watched the additional squad cars and finally the ambulance appear. The bartender returned after 10 minutes and a customer followed at his heels. A short beer, Joe. This is my second brandy, I said. Joe collected my change. The druggist down the street got himself murdered. Looks like it was by the man who kills people because they're not polite. The customer watched him draw a beer. How do you figure that? It could have just been a hold-up. Joe shook his head. No. Fred Masters? He's got the TV shop across the street, found the body, and he read the note. The customer put a dime in the bar. I'm not going to cry about it. I always took my business someplace else. He acted as though he was doing you a favor every time he waited on you. Joe nodded. I don't think anyone in the neighborhood's going to miss him. He always made a lot of trouble. I had been about to leave and return to the drugstore to give myself up, but now I ordered another brandy and took out my notebook. I began making a list of names. It was surprising how one followed another. They were bitter memories, some large, some small, some I had experienced and many more that I had witnessed, and perhaps felt more than the victims. Names. And that warehouseman, I didn't even know his name, but I must include him. I remembered the day, and Miss Newman. We were her 6th graders, and she had taken us on another one of her excursions, this time to the warehouse along the river, where she was going to show us how industry works. She always planned her tours, and always asked permission of the places we visited, but this time she strayed, or became lost, and we arrived at the warehouse. She and the 30 children who adored her, and the warehouseman had ordered her out. He had used language which we did not understand, but we sensed its intent, and he had directed it against us and Miss Newman. She was small, and she had been frightened, and we retreated. And Miss Newman did not report to school the next day or any day after that, and we learned that she had asked for a transfer. And I, who loved her too, knew why. She could not face us after that. Was he still alive? He had been in his 20s then, I imagined. When I left the bar, a half an hour later, I realized I had a great deal of work to do. The succeeding days were busy ones, and among others, I found the warehouseman, told him why he was dying, because he did not remember. And when that was done, I dropped into a restaurant not far away. The waitress eventually broke off her conversation with the cashier and strode to my table. What do you want? I ordered a steak and tomatoes. The steak proved to be just what one could expect in such a neighborhood. As I reached for my coffee spoon, I accidentally dropped it to the floor. I picked it up. "Waitress, would you mind bringing me another spoon, please?" She stalked angrily to my table and snatched the spoon from my hand. "You got the shakes or something?" She returned a few minutes later and was about to deposit a spoon with considerable emphasis upon my table. Then a sudden thought altered the harsh expression in her face. The descent of the arm diminuendoed, and when the spoon touched the tablecloth, it touched gently, very gently. She laughed nervously. "I'm sorry if I was sharp, mister." It was an apology, and so I said, "That's quite all right. I mean, you can drop a spoon any time you want. I'll be glad to get you another." "Thank you." I turned to my coffee. "You're not offended, are you, mister?" she asked eagerly. "No, not at all." She snatched a newspaper from the empty neighboring table. "Here, sir, you can read this while you eat. I mean, it's on the house, free." When she left, the wide-eyed cashier stared at her. "What's with all that, Mabel?" Mabel glanced back at me with a trace of uneasiness. "You never can tell who he might be. You better be polite these days." As I ate, I read, and an item caught my eye. A grown man had heated pennies in a frying pan and tossed them out to some children who had been making trick-or-treat rounds before Halloween. He had been fined a miserable $20. I made a note of his name and address. Mr. Briller finished his examination. "You can get dressed now, Mr. Turner." I picked up my shirt. I don't suppose some new miracle drug has been developed since I was here last." He laughed with self-enjoyed good nature. "No, I'm afraid not." He watched me button the shirt. "By the way, have you decided what you're going to do with your remaining time?" I had, but I thought I'd say, "Not yet." He was faintly perturbed. "You really should, you know. Only about 3 months left. And be sure to let me know when you do." While I finished dressing, he sat down at the desk and glanced at the newspaper lying there. "The killer seems to be rather busy, doesn't he?" He turned a page. "But really, the most surprising thing about the crime seems to be the public's reaction. Have you read the letters from the People column lately?" "No." "These murders appear to be meeting with almost universal approval. Some of the letters even hint that they might be able to supply the murderer with a few choice names themselves. I would have to get a paper." "Not only that," Dr. Briller said, "but a wave of politeness has struck the city." I put on my coat. "Shall I come back in 2 weeks?" He put aside the paper. "Yes, and try to look at this whole thing as cheerfully as possible. We all have to go someday." But his day was indeterminate and presumably in the distant future. My appointment with Dr. Briller had been in the evening, and it was nearly 10 by the time I left my bus and began the short walk to my apartment building. As I approached the last corner, I heard a shot and turned into Milding Lane and found a little man with a revolver standing over a newly dead body on the quiet, deserted sidewalk. I looked down at the corpse. "Goodness, a policeman." The little man nodded. "Yes, what I've done seems a little extreme, but you see, he was using a variety of language that was entirely unnecessary." "Ah," I said. The little man nodded. "I'd parked my car in front of this fire hydrant, extremely inadvertently, I assure you, and the policeman was waiting when I returned to my car. He also discovered that I'd forgotten my driver's license. I could not have acted as I did, or I would not have acted as I did if he had simply written out a ticket. For I was guilty, sir, and I readily admit it. But he was not content with that. He made embarrassing observations concerning my intelligence, my eyesight, and the possibility that I'd stolen the car. And finally, on the legitimacy of my birth." He blinked at a fond memory. "And my mother was an angel, sir. An angel." I remember a time when I'd been apprehended while absent-mindedly jaywalking. I would contritely have accepted the customary warning or even a ticket, but the officer insisted upon a profane lecture before a grinning assemblage of interested pedestrians. Most humiliating. The little man looked at the gun in his hand. I bought this just today, and actually I'd intended to use it on the superintendent of my apartment building. A bully. I agreed. Surly fellows. He sighed. But now I suppose I'll have to turn myself over to the police. I gave it thought. He watched me. He cleared his throat. Or perhaps I should just leave a note. You see, I've been reading the newspapers about... I lent him my notebook. He wrote a few lines, signed his initials, and deposited the slip of paper between the 2 buttons of the dead officer's jacket. He handed the notebook back to me. I must remember to get one of these. He opened the door of his car. Can I drop you off anywhere? No, thank you, I said. It's a nice evening. I'd rather walk. Pleasant fellow, I reflected as I left him. Too bad there weren't more like him.